Have you ever heard about COP or Conference of Parties? It is a cornerstone to global climate governance. Since the 1995, nations have convened annually to negotiate solutions to climate change under the UN Framework Convention. It is a stage where agreements like the historical Paris Agreement of 2015 were born, uniting countries towards limiting global warming. These conferences are where ambitions are set, progress is reviewed, and new pledges are made. In this video, we are going to uncover the COP's role and the key developments towards climate change.
But I want to start just by reminding us about the Paris Climate Agreement, which was in 2015, at the end of 2015. And the Paris document, which is well worth reading, it's not very long, but it makes the point that virtually every country in the world has signed up to reduce emissions in line with holding global temperature rises to less than well below 2 degrees centigrade, and ideally aim for 1.5. It also agreed that it would do this in accordance with the best science and, very importantly, in my view, on the basis of equity. And that has been completely ignored. There's been a little bit of lip service to it, but nothing serious from any part of the world, particularly the wealthy parts of the world, in relation to equity between the poorer and the wealthy countries, but also, of course, equity within countries. So what's been the real response to Paris and the climate emergency? Well, we've seen no sweeping and rapid social change like we saw in the banking crisis or COVID. We've seen no immediate and widespread penetration of low carbon technologies, which we've seen, say, with the vaccine and so forth. What we've seen is more renewables, plus more oil, gas, and indeed more coal. We've seen some electric vehicles, plus more petrol and diesel cars. And we actually, if you look at the EU, it's selling now more sports utility vehicles than it is selling electric cars. We've seen some improvements in efficiency, plus more consumption. And let's remind ourselves, the climate does not care about renewables or efficiency or EVs. It only cares about carbon dioxide molecules. So we can't have these other things as well as oil and gas. We have to have them as a substitute to them. And that's what we have failed to do so far. But what we've now developed is this whole language of net zero, which in my view should be more like not zero, or I prefer to see net as being Latin for kick the can down the road. It's a way of broadly supporting incremental changes to business as usual. It's an incredibly dangerous framing of climate change. And I will come back to that later. So what does the IPCC tell us about Paris, about our commitments when we think about mitigation? Well, if you look at the reports from 2015 right the way through to the latest one last year and summarize them all, what they say is that it's the total carbon budget, not long-term targets, that link to temperature. So what you do by 2050 or even 2030 in isolation is not important. What matters is the carbon budget. And to put that in some sort of stylistic terms, it's the area under the curve you can see here. So what we do by 2050 is of much less importance than what we do in the near term. And so if in the near term, we decide to expand our airports, increase our oil and gas production, drive further and so forth, then that passes a much greater burden onto future generations, a burden that I would argue would be impossible to deliver on. And that's why we have to do some really big things today. So that's the sort of carbon budget framing. And that's what the science tells us. But the Paris Agreement and every agreement from 1992 onwards has said that we need to reduce emissions on the basis of equity. There's another awful acronym called CBDR, Common but Differentiated Responsibility. And that's basically, it's an agreement from 1992 onwards that the wealthy countries will show leadership and will reduce emissions ahead of the poorer countries. Now, the poor countries will have to do quite a lot, but the wealthy countries should be demonstrating some leadership on this. I would argue, regardless of our moral or political position, Paris plus the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change equals equity. Equity is not a nice to have, it's absolute prerequisite of meeting our commitments. You cannot squeeze emissions out of people that do not emit. And a final sort of thought for African nations, and this is my only real comment, I would suggest getting your own house in order, being guided by equity in terms of emissions is really important. And there's obviously a huge difference in Africa. I think South Africa is about 8 tons per person. Kenya runs about 0.3, Rwanda about 0.1. And so there are very big differences in terms of emissions across Africa. But at the same time, and I think this is my key message, the bit I do know a bit about, is that you need to put all the pressure you can on the wealthy, high-emitting nations. Do not trust them. Do not trust us. Check our numbers. Read our spreadsheets. Look out for scams like offsetting carbon dioxide removal. We are doing everything we can to pass the burden on to our own children and to the poorer parts of the world. Look carefully behind our headlines and our eloquent speeches, because that's all they are. They are just rhetoric so far. There is no reality behind them. And don't argue over the $100 billion that's been claimed. Actually, the wealthy countries haven't even delivered on yet. That's to help some of the poorer countries deal with the impacts of climate change. The $100 billion is a crumb that's fallen off our rich person's table. You should be demanding the trillions of dollars that I would argue are owed to the poor parts of the world. First, for reparation, because what we have done is damaged your prospects. Two things: we've damaged your environment, and we are damaging that today in terms of the impacts of climate change. But we're also damaging your prospects. In 2022, climate change has become system change. As Einstein noted, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And thus far, we have chosen to pass on to our own children the consequences of 31 years of such insanity. And I would argue net zero by 2050 or 2045 or 2060 for India is the latest incarnation of that insanity. So we need to think, we need to be doing far more than any of the rhetoric we ever hear at the COPs. So on that note, thanks very much for listening.
Global summits like COP remind us the power of corrective action. This year, COP 2019 has a theme focusing on enhancing ambitions and enabling actions, ensuring inclusivity. Let's stay informed and inspired to make a difference. #ClimateAction.